I'd open this one with a moral question rather than shock, because the story is really about truth, blood, and whether family is love or leverage. If the man who raised you dies before you learn he was never your real father, does that erase the life he gave you or make every memory feel negotiated? I found out through a medical test in a hospital room that smelled too clean for a lie that old. By the end of that week, my mother's decades-long affair was no longer a secret. Neither was the reason my family had buried it under money, marriage, and inheritance. What hurt most wasn't learning whose blood I carried. It was learning how many people benefited from my silence. Stay with me, and when it's over, tell me where you're watching from, and whether you think truth heals a family or destroys it. The first thing Rowan Mercer noticed when she walked back into St. Catherine's Cardiac Pavilion was the smell. Not antiseptic exactly. Not that sharp medicinal sting people used to describe when they wanted to sound brave about hospitals. This was softer than that. Filtered air, ground coffee from the lobby kiosk, fresh paint somewhere down the east corridor. Money mostly. The kind of money that made illness look organized. The Mercer family had always preferred institutions that looked calm from a distance. The lobby was all pale limestone floors, brushed brass fixtures, and arrangements of white orchids that had no business looking so alive in a building full of monitored hearts. A volunteer at the front desk smiled the way expensive hospitals trained people to smile, warm but measured, as if fear could be softened by good posture. Rowan signed in, thanked her, and took the private elevator to the 6th floor. She wore a charcoal coat over a black knit dress and low heels practical enough for bad weather and long hours. Her hair was pinned back in the tidy way she defaulted to when she knew she would need to think clearly. On anyone else, the look might have read polished. On Rowan, it read defensive. She had learned years ago that control was easier to maintain when there were no loose strands, no unnecessary gestures, no visible signs of inner weather. Her father was scheduled for a high-risk cardiac procedure in 48 hours. Even in her own head, she still called him her father. The phrase arrived automatically, with the same reflexive certainty as an old address or a childhood phone number. Gideon Mercer, 68, founder of Mercer Holdings, builder of waterfront towers, suburban retail corridors, luxury redevelopment projects that turned working neighborhoods into magazine features. The man had spent 4 decades converting land into proof of his will. Now his heart had become the one structure in his life he could not bully into compliance. The request from the hospital had come 3 days earlier. Immediate family members were being asked to complete an updated genetic and familial risk panel before the procedure. There were concerns about the pattern of his condition, the sort that required a cleaner map of hereditary markers. Rowan almost said no. Her brother Elias had more time, more proximity, more appetite for family duty dressed up as strategy. Their mother Celeste would have done whatever was requested if it meant appearing composed in the right waiting room. But Rowan was a lawyer, and lawyers developed bad habits around paperwork. Once she saw that the consent language had been revised twice and that the hospital's genetic counseling department had flagged the request for direct follow-up, she agreed to come in herself. That was how she ended up in a gray upholstered chair outside a consultation room on the 6th floor, staring at a minimalist watercolor of reeds by a lake while a nurse moved quietly past with a clipboard. Her phone buzzed. "Elias, where are you?" Rowan stared at the message for a moment before typing back. "Genetics consult." The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then vanished. Then, "Mother says dinner moved to 7. Don't make this harder than it already is." She locked the screen without answering. That was Elias in a sentence. He could compress accusation, fatigue, and performance management into 12 words. At 41, he had already settled into the kind of expensive middle age that made men look as though they had been born wearing tailored coats. He ran Mercer Holdings now, or most of it. Gideon still occupied the symbolic center, but Elias handled lenders, boards, refinanced debt, and all the careful smiling that kept a family business from looking like a private monarchy. Rowan had once admired his composure. Then she grew up enough to recognize it as a survival skill. The consultation room door opened. A woman in her late 40s stepped out, slim and composed, with dark hair cut just below the jaw and glasses that made her look severe until she smiled, which she didn't exactly, not at first. Her expression was professional in the purest sense, clear, attentive, unwilling to insult anyone with false cheer. "Ms. Mercer?" she asked. Rowan stood. "Yes, I'm Dr. Mira Sloan. Thank you for waiting." Her voice was low and even, with the kind of gentleness that came not from softness, but from repetition. She had delivered difficult information before, many times. Rowan could tell in the first 3 seconds. "Doctor?" Sloan led her into an office that looked less like an exam room than a therapist's room designed by a board of trustees. 2 chairs angled toward each other, a box of tissues placed discreetly on a side table, not centered, never centered, a framed certificate from Columbia, a small ceramic bowl of wrapped peppermints beside a legal pad. Rowan sat. Dr. Sloan did the same, folding one leg over the other with careful economy. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to clarify that the lab reran your sample and confirmed chain of custody. I know these discussions can be unsettling, and I'd rather answer your questions directly than create confusion." Rowan felt something inside her go still. Most people imagined bad news as impact, a collision, a break. But the moments she remembered most clearly from her life had all begun with stillness. The second before a judge issued a ruling. The second before a husband said something he could not take back. The second before a person understood that the room they were standing in was not the room they thought they had entered. "All right," Rowan said. Dr. Sloan rested her hands on her knee. "Your testing was originally ordered as part of a hereditary risk review related to your father's cardiac profile. In the course of that review, the lab identified a significant inconsistency between the biological relationship reported and the markers reflected in your results." Rowan's face stayed neutral. Years of depositions had taught her that stillness could be an instrument. "Inconsistency," she repeated. "Yes." Dr. Sloan did not rush. "To be precise, the genetic data does not support a biological parent-child relationship between you and Gideon Mercer." The room did not spin. That was the strange part. No cinematic rupture, no sharp inhale, no dropping coffee cup, no flood of memories rearranging themselves on impact. Just a clean, internal click, as if a lock had turned somewhere behind her ribs. Rowan looked at the framed certificate on the wall because it seemed easier for 1 second to look at something earned than something true. "You reran the sample." "We did." "And verified identity?" "Yes." "No clerical crossover, no contamination, no mislabeled accession?" "No." Dr. Sloan paused. "I know that's a lot to absorb." Rowan almost said, "You don't know the half of it," but that would have implied she already understood the shape of what this meant, and she didn't. Not yet. "What exactly has been documented?" she asked instead. Dr. Sloan's eyes sharpened with what might have been respect. "The lab report notes a non-paternity finding relative to the reported parent-child relationship. At this point, access is limited to the medical team involved in your father's care, the genetics department, and you. My family has not been informed? Not by us. Would they be? Only if medically necessary and only under the appropriate disclosure rules." She tilted her head slightly. "Ms. Mercer, I'm obligated to ask whether you'd like support before you leave today." "Support?" Rowan nearly laughed, not because it was absurd, but because it was so small compared to the architecture of the sentence she had just been handed. "A counselor, a pamphlet, a glass of water." "My father's procedure," Rowan said. "Does this change anything relevant to treatment?" "For him, not immediately. For family history going forward, potentially, yes." Family history. Rowan thought of Gideon's square, imposing hands, of Elias's broad shoulders. of the old family photographs lining the staircase in the Hudson Valley house, all of them professionally lit, all of them carefully spaced, as if even affection needed room to breathe in a Mercer frame. She had always resembled her mother more. People said that as if it explained anything. Celeste's fine bones, Celeste's pale eyes, Celeste's stillness in social settings that made everyone else feel overfurnished. Rowan had inherited that stillness too, though hers had sharpened instead of softened over time. "When did the inconsistency first appear?" she asked. "In the initial review, we requested confirmation before contacting you." "And you called me directly?" "Yes." Rowan nodded once. Dr. Sloan waited, perhaps expecting grief to enter the room now that the facts had been laid out with appropriate precision. But grief was not the first visitor. Suspicion was. Not loud suspicion, not the dramatic kind that pointed fingers and built conspiracy walls in a single afternoon. This was colder than that. More methodical. The suspicion of a woman who knew something about documents, family systems, and what powerful people chose to formalize versus what they preferred to leave in the dark. Her father was not just any father. He was Gideon Mercer. Nothing in his life existed by accident if it could be managed. And yet Dr. Sloan sat across from her, careful and composed, telling her that the central biological claim of her entire life had failed under laboratory review. "Can I have a copy of the report?" Rowan asked. "Of course." "And the confirmation notes." "I can arrange that." Rowan stood before Dr. Sloan did. It wasn't intentional. It was reflex. Movement gave shape back to the body. For the first time, Dr. Sloan's expression softened past professionalism into something closer to human concern. "Ms. Mercer," she said, "these findings can complicate how people understand themselves. You don't need to decide what this means today." But Rowan was already deciding one thing. She would not confront her mother in a hallway. She would not call Elias from the elevator. She would not walk into Gideon Mercer's hospital room, carrying a truth she herself had not yet touched from all sides. "No," Rowan said quietly, "I imagine I don't." The elevator ride down was silent except for the gentle mechanical hum and the blood in her ears. When the doors opened into the private wing, she saw her mother first. Celeste Mercer stood near a window with her hands loosely folded, wearing winter white and a camel coat draped over one arm. She looked immaculate in the way women from old money somehow managed even in hospitals, as though gravity had signed a private agreement not to disturb them in public. Her silver blonde hair was smooth at the nape. Her pearl earrings were small and deliberate. She turned when Rowan stepped out, and for one impossible second, Rowan thought, she knows. Not because of anything dramatic, because Celeste did not ask what took so long. She only said, "You're pale." It was such a Celeste sentence that Rowan might have missed the danger in it if she hadn't been listening differently now. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "What did they say?" Just an observation. Cool and almost aesthetic, as if Rowan's face were a room arrangement slightly off balance. "I'm fine," Rowan said. Celeste studied her for a beat too long, then looked away first. "Your father's resting. Elias had to take a call." "Of course he did." From down the corridor, Rowan could see the glass door to Gideon's suite. Even from a distance, the room radiated the strange hush that wealth purchased around weakness. She imagined him inside, propped against expensive pillows, irritated by his own body, annoyed by dependence, still somehow managing to look like a man receiving quarterly reports instead of cardiac care. Her father. The phrase came again, and this time it landed wrong. Not false. Not yet. But unstable. Elias emerged from the suite a moment later, phone in hand, navy suit immaculate, expression already tuned to controlled impatience. He took one look at Rowan and frowned. "What happened in there?" he asked. Such an ordinary question, such a dangerous one. Rowan looked at him, at her mother, at the polished floor reflecting all three of them in broken, pale shapes. The answer was simple enough in language, but nothing about it felt survivable in public. "Nothing that concerns you right now," she said. Elias opened his mouth, ready to object. Then Gideon's voice came faintly through the partly open door, rough with age and irritation and familiarity. "Is that Rowan?" Her whole body reacted to the sound before her mind did. That, more than the test results, frightened her. Because whatever the lab had proved upstairs, some part of her nervous system still turned toward him, like history was fact. Rowan smoothed one hand over the front of her dress, feeling suddenly like a witness walking toward the wrong stand. And as she crossed the threshold into his room, one thought rose above the others. Quiet, cold, fully formed now. In a family like hers, a secret this old was never held by one person alone. It lived because more than one person had needed it. Rowan had always thought the Hudson Valley house was too large for sincerity. Even as a child, she had understood that size and warmth were not the same thing. The Mercer estate sat back from the road behind stone pillars and black iron gates, all of it arranged with the kind of confidence that assumed permanence could be bought if one chose the right architect. A long gravel drive curved through clipped hedges and winter bare trees before opening onto the main house. Limestone facade, mullioned windows, slate roof, and a central portico grand enough to make arrival feel ceremonial even when you were only coming home from school. It was the kind of house people admired before they entered it. Inside, it was quiet in the expensive, deliberate way Rowan associated with museums and law libraries. Sound never carried properly here. It was absorbed by runner rugs, paneled walls, upholstered benches no one sat on, and generations of careful decisions designed to keep mess from becoming visible. Even now, with Gideon still in the hospital and the family orbiting around his procedure, the house looked composed. Lamps were lit on timers. The flowers in the front hall had been refreshed. The decanters in the study gleamed as if illness itself had been instructed not to leave fingerprints. Rowan arrived just after noon with a small suitcase, her work bag, and the flat, metallic exhaustion that followed a bad night without sleep. She had gone back to her hotel after leaving the hospital, showered, opened the genetics report twice without truly reading it, then closed her laptop and spent 2 hours staring at a dark window while the city shifted around her. By morning, the shock had thinned into something far more useful. Curiosity, not the soft kind. Not the human urge to understand pain so it hurt less. This was legal curiosity, structural curiosity, the kind that wanted sequence, access, revisions, signatures, and motive. If a truth had survived 36 years inside a family like hers, it had not survived on sentiment alone. It had been managed. Mrs. Alvarez met her in the front hall, taking her coat before Rowan had fully crossed the threshold. She had worked for the Mercers since Rowan was in middle school, though worked for never quite captured women like her. Mrs. Alvarez, compact and silver-haired, with sharp dark eyes and a waist apron that somehow never looked old-fashioned, ran the internal logic of the house more efficiently than any assistant Gideon had ever hired for his office. "Your room is ready," she said. "Your mother is out for an hour. Elias is on calls." "Thank you." Mrs. Alvarez's gaze lingered on Rowan's face a fraction too long. Not intrusive, not prying, just the quiet assessment of someone who noticed everything and had learned long ago not to announce it. "Would you like tea sent up?" "No, I'm fine." It was the wrong answer, and both of them knew it, but Mrs. Alvarez only nodded and stepped aside. Rowan took the central staircase slowly, one hand brushing the banister polished to a soft shine by decades of maintenance. The family photographs still lined the wall at precise intervals: gala portraits, graduation portraits, studio portraits, black tie charity events, summer weekends on Martha's Vineyard. The visual record of a family who had always understood that being seen mattered almost as much as being real. She stopped halfway up in front of one taken when she was about 10. Celeste sat in a pale blue suit with one gloved hand resting on the arm of a chair. Gideon stood behind her, broad and formal, both hands closed over the chair back like he was staking a claim. Elias, already taller than Rowan by then, stood on the opposite side in a blazer he had probably hated. Rowan herself was seated slightly forward, ankles crossed, hair smooth, chin lifted in obedient stillness. They looked like a family. That was the problem with photographs. They recorded alignment, not truth. By the time she reached the second-floor landing, her pulse had steadied into its working rhythm. Her room had not changed much. Fresh flowers on the desk, heavy cream curtains, a bay window overlooking the lower gardens and the frozen reflecting pond. On the dresser, someone had placed a folded cashmere throw in a color Rowan would never have chosen for herself, but that Celeste probably thought red restful. She set down her bag and opened the curtains wider. From up here, the estate looked even more controlled. Terraces cut into the slope, gravel paths curving through clipped boxwood, a small glass conservatory visible beyond the west lawn. Every line suggested stewardship, legacy, continuity. It almost made her laugh. Rowan didn't unpack. Instead, she sat at the writing desk, opened her laptop, and began making a list. Not feelings, facts, hospital timeline, genetics consult, access points, family members present, questions to verify, documents to locate. Then a separate column, trust revisions, advance directives, power of attorney, recent legal activity, private communications. By the time she finished, the page looked less like a daughter's notes and more like the opening strategy memo for a contested estate file. The familiarity of that calmed her more than anything else had since yesterday. At 2:30, she went downstairs. Gideon's study was on the west side of the house behind a pair of walnut doors that remained open during the day and shut at night. Even from the hallway, it carried his taste unmistakably. Leather, paper, peat smoke worked deep into old upholstery and the faint mineral smell of stone from the fireplace. The room had always seemed less like an office and more like a private court. People entered. Gideon remained seated. Outcomes followed. Now the desk was empty except for a brass reading lamp, a square tray with unopened mail, and a legal pad covered in one of his assistant's clean block handwriting. No laptop, no active files, no visible signs of illness, vulnerability, or transition. Someone had tidied the room with the thoroughness of a person instructed to leave nothing careless behind, which meant, Rowan thought, that carelessness might matter more than usual. She began with the obvious. The leather credenza beneath the windows held old annual reports, presentation books, property prospectuses, and binders of correspondence too polished to be useful. A cabinet near the fireplace contained guest lists, foundation stationery, and past gala seating charts. Celeste territory, not Gideon's real work. A side drawer in the desk gave her a stack of recent appointment cards, 2 fountain pens, a Mont Blanc ink bottle, and an index tab from Daniel Keene's office. That name made her pause. Daniel Keene had been the Mercer family's outside counsel for so long that Rowan could not remember meeting him for the first time. He existed in her childhood memory the way mahogany existed in that house. Dark, expensive, quietly permanent. Tall, narrow-shouldered, with a lined face that looked as if it had been folded carefully rather than aged, Keene had the rare ability to make silence feel billable. He handled the family trusts, private holdings, intergenerational transfers, and the class of conversation that began with strictly confidential and ended with no one feeling relieved. Rowan took out her phone and checked the family calendar app that Celeste insisted on using for major household coordination. Visits had been color-coded, as always. Hospital, board, foundation, Keene again. And again, too many in too short a period. This was not the normal frequency of routine updating. Something significant had changed in the last 8 months. Not necessarily suspicious on its face. Older founders revised structures all the time when health shifted. But in the context of everything else, it moved from ordinary to relevant. She photographed the appointment list, then erased her own fingerprints from the edge of the drawer out of habit, so ingrained it almost depressed her. The safe was built into the back wall behind a landscape painting no one in the family actually liked. Gideon had chosen it because it was large enough to justify the space. Rowan knew this because he had once complained about the framing. She remembered watching him move the canvas aside when she was 14, not because he trusted her, but because powerful men often confused being observed with being understood. The keypad lit under her touch. She stared at it for a moment, then entered the 6 digits she suspected he would still be arrogant enough to use. The safe clicked open. For one irrational instant, she expected vindication. Files, letters, an intact architecture of secrets waiting to confirm that yesterday's lab report belonged inside a larger pattern. Instead, she found mostly absence. The upper shelves had clearly been emptied recently. Rectangular outlines and dust, one unused envelope box, a velvet case with nothing inside, a folder labeled Legacy Materials that contained no papers at all. Only the bottom compartment held anything substantial. A narrow cream envelope, a hotel invoice, a torn photograph, a business card. That was it. Rowan knelt on the carpet and laid the contents carefully beside each other. The invoice was from Aspen, dated 37 years earlier, from a mountain resort expensive enough to still be discreet. 2 guests, 1 suite. Paid through a private account name she recognized as one of Gideon's older holding entities. The photograph had been ripped cleanly down the middle, but not recently. Time had softened the paper at the tear. On the surviving half, she could see part of a terrace railing, an alpine background, and the left side of a woman's coat. She would have known anywhere. Cream wool, sharp shoulder line, Celeste's hand in profile holding a wine glass. Whoever had been standing to her right was gone now, removed with intention. The business card read, Julian Vale, MD Cardiology. On the back in Celeste's handwriting were 6 words written fast enough to look unlike her. Not now. He's already suspicious. Rowan sat back on her heels. Julian Vale. The name was not unfamiliar. Dr. Vale had been around the edges of Mercer life for years. Holiday cards, foundation dinners, whispered references to Julian's board, the occasional summer appearance when Rowan was younger. He was one of those men wealthy families collected with ease, intelligent, useful, socially polished, old enough to be trusted, handsome enough to be remembered. She had not thought about him in years. Now his name sat in her father's safe beside an Aspen invoice and half a photograph. Not proof, not even close, but not nothing. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it, then stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the bare trees without seeing them. It was one thing to receive a clinical conclusion from a genetic counselor in a soft chair with peppermints on the table. It was another to feel the first physical grain of history shift under her hands. A floorboard creaked behind her. Rowan turned. Naomi stood in the doorway, carrying a porcelain cup and saucer she had no reason to be carrying herself. She was one of those women people underestimated because they made the error of calling her elegant before they called her observant. Slim, dark-haired, always put together without appearing decorative, Naomi had the kind of beauty sharpened by intention rather than ease. Her clothes never wore her. Her smile never arrived by accident. She had married into Mercer money 12 years ago, but she had not been born to it, which meant she understood its value and its fragility better than most people in the family. "I thought I heard someone in here," she said lightly. "Mrs. Alvarez said you skipped tea." I wasn't aware my hydration was now a household concern. Naomi smiled at that, but only with her mouth. Everything is a household concern this week. She set the cup on the corner of the desk as if she belonged there. Chamomile from the smell of it. Rowan doubted the choice was random. "Elias says you're staying through the procedure," Naomi continued. "That's good. Your mother needs steadiness around her." The sentence was generous in tone and territorial in structure. Rowan recognized the move immediately. Naomi wasn't trying to comfort her. She was placing people back into roles. "And what does Elias need?" Rowan asked. Naomi glanced toward the desk, the credenza, the safe painting now flush against the wall. Just a flicker, but enough. "Predictability," she said. "Don't we all?" Rowan leaned one hip against the window ledge. You seem tense? Naomi gave a soft laugh. Your father-in-law's major procedure, a board that won't stop circling, and a house full of half-finished conversations? Tense seems proportional. My father-in-law, Rowan thought. Not your father. Not Gideon. Naomi was often most revealing when she chose the technically correct phrase over the intimate one. Then Naomi stepped a little closer, lowering her voice without making it confidential. I don't know what happened at the hospital yesterday, but something did. You came back different. There it was. Not knowledge, instinct. Rowan said nothing. Naomi studied her for one beat, then reached for the saucer. I'm sure it's nothing that can't wait until after Friday, she said. At moments like this, stability matters more than anything. She left before Rowan could answer, which was its own kind of answer. When the door clicked shut, Rowan looked back at the painting over the safe. Chapter 1 had given her a fact. This house had just given her a pattern, and somewhere inside the family, Naomi had already felt the floor begin to move. Rowan called Lenora Pike at 8:10 the next morning and got voicemail. Not the modern kind with a cheerful prompt and a name recorded twice for clarity. This was older, flatter, almost austere. A woman's voice saying only, "Leave a message." Rowan did not. She tried again at 11:40, this time from the small stone terrace outside the breakfast room, while Celeste sat inside with untouched grapefruit and the financial section folded to a page she had not turned in 20 minutes. Mrs. Alvarez moved in and out with silver coffee pots. Somewhere deeper in the house, Elias was on a call, his voice rising and lowering with that cultivated executive patience that usually meant someone else was about to lose money. Voicemail again. Lenora Pike had been Gideon's private secretary for almost 25 years before retiring to Connecticut. Not assistant, not administrator. Secretary, the old-fashioned kind, someone who knew where paper lived, which promises had been written down, and which ones had been arranged with nothing more than a look and a second phone line. Rowan remembered her from childhood as a tall woman with precise lipstick, severe skirts, and an air of permanent economy, as though she considered most conversation an overextended expense. If there was anyone outside the bloodline who might know how long a secret had been living in this family, it was Lenora. Whether she would say anything was another matter. At 1:15, Rowan left the house without announcing where she was going. She took her own car, not one of the drivers, and ignored the text from Elias that arrived just after she passed the lower gate. Board counsel may be at the hospital later. Stay reachable. She did not answer. Lenora's town in western Connecticut had the restrained prettiness of places that never needed to advertise themselves. White church steeple. Brick library. A coffee shop with hand-painted signage and prices higher than the decor justified. The roads narrowed as Rowan drove farther from the center, past stone walls laced with winter vines and old maples stripped bare against the sky. Lenora's house stood at the end of a short lane behind a stand of cedar, gray clapboard, black shutters, a narrow porch, the yard neat without vanity. No landscaping meant to impress, no gates, no performance of legacy. It looked like the home of a woman who had spent most of her life organizing other people's success and had chosen, finally, to live inside proportion. Rowan knocked once and waited. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, and heard movement within. Slow steps, then the deadbolt drawn back. Lenora Pike opened the door wearing a slate-colored cardigan over a black turtleneck, her white hair cut close around the face in a style that was practical without softening her. Age had thinned her but not gentled her. Her cheekbones remained severe. So did her eyes, gray, direct, intelligent, in the unforgiving way of people who had spent their working lives listening more carefully than everyone around them. For a second, neither woman spoke. Then Lenora said, I assumed if I ignored the first two calls, you'd understand that as an answer. I understood it as an evasion, Rowan said. One corner of Lenora's mouth moved, not quite a smile. You sound more like your father every year. The phrase landed strangely enough that Rowan almost corrected it. Instead, she said, May I come in? Lenora kept her hand on the edge of the door. That depends. On what? On whether you've come here for truth or ammunition. The answer should have been immediate. It wasn't. That, Rowan realized, was answer enough. Lenora stepped aside anyway. The house smelled faintly of paper, tea leaves, and cedar smoke. A wool runner stretched down the hall. The living room held 2 bookcases, a dark green sofa, a side table stacked with New Yorker back issues, and a writing desk by the window with a brass reading lamp. No television in sight, no framed family portraits, just one black and white photograph on the mantel of a younger Lenora standing beside a sailboat, unsmiling beneath a scarf blown sideways by wind. "Kitchen," Lenora said. "I don't entertain in the living room." "I didn't realize this was social." "It isn't." The kitchen was warm and spare, copper kettle on the stove, white enamel canisters, a wooden table rubbed nearly satin at the edges by years of use. Lenora gestured to a chair, then took the one opposite without offering coffee, tea, or comfort. Rowan set her bag on the floor and opened with the cleanest card she had. "I was told by the hospital genetics department that Gideon Mercer is not my biological father." Lenora's face did not change. That was worse than surprise. "I see," she said. "No," Rowan replied. "I don't think you do." Lenora folded her hands. "I think I do exactly." Rowan let the silence stretch. The old woman did not flinch from it. "I found a card," Rowan said finally. "Julian Vale in Gideon's safe, with my mother's handwriting on the back, and an invoice from Aspen, and half a photograph." Now something moved across Lenora's features, not shock, but fatigue. A recognition that the past had finally managed to outlive the people who had tried to contain it. "You opened his safe," she said. "I opened my father's safe." Lenora's gaze sharpened. "Did you?" The room changed at that. Not in sound or temperature, in moral weight. Rowan felt it settle between them. "I'm not here to play games," she said. "Neither am I." Lenora leaned back slightly. "That was one of the jobs your father paid me for. Games, cover, sequence, timing. Making sure one thing never touched another in daylight." "Then stop doing the job." Lenora looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, Rowan saw something beyond discipline in her face. Weariness, yes, but threaded through with a kind of old contempt, not for Rowan, not even for Celeste or Gideon exactly, but for the elaborate machinery people built around cowardice and then insisted on calling complexity. "It was not one affair," Lenora said at last. "If that's the version of events you came here hoping to confirm, save yourself the simplification." Rowan did not move. "Your mother and Julian Vale had an arrangement," Lenora continued. "I suppose if one wanted to be generous, one could call it a relationship. It was not a weekend, not a mistake after too much wine, not a single bad season in a marriage. It was years. There it was. The word itself should have felt cinematic. It didn't. It felt administrative. Years. Something ongoing, logged nowhere, renewable, managed." "How many?" Rowan asked. "I don't know when it began," Lenora said. "I know when it became my problem, around the time the Mercer accounts were being restructured after the Albany acquisition mess. Your mother had already been seeing him by then." "Seeing him where?" Lenora gave her a dry look. "Hotels, conferences, foundation events, medical boards, the sort of respectable overlap rich people create when they want privacy without scandal." "And Gideon knew." This time Lenora did not answer immediately. "He suspected first," she said. "Then he knew." "When?" "Early." "How early?" Lenora rose, crossed to the counter, and shut off the kettle before it began to whistle. She did not pour the water. She simply stood there with one hand on the handle, back half turned to Rowan, as if choosing a degree of honesty required physical bracing. "Early enough that your existence did not surprise him," she said. The sentence moved through Rowan like cold metal. She stared at Lenora's profile. "You're saying he knew before I was born." "I'm saying he knew there was a possibility, and I'm saying he decided very quickly that possibility would not be discussed." Why? Lenora turned back. There was no gentleness in her now, only clarity. Because divorce at that moment would have been catastrophic, she said, because your father's finances were more fragile than the public understood, because there were transactions moving through names and entities that did not need the attention a public marital split would have invited, because your mother had become legally inconvenient, because image mattered, because timing mattered, because powerful people often prefer a lie they can use to a truth they can survive. Rowan looked down at her hands on the table and saw that they were steady. She had expected rage at some point, or grief, or the humiliating impulse to ask a question as childish as, "Did he ever love me anyway?" Instead, what she felt was insult, not the sharp kind. The deep kind, the kind that came from understanding you, had been built into a system without consent. "He let me carry his name because it was useful," she said. Lenora did not correct her. The absence of correction hurt more than agreement. "And Julian?" Rowan asked. "What was he getting out of this arrangement?" "You'd have to ask Julian what name he gives his own weakness." Lenora sat again, slower this time. "Access, perhaps. Your mother. The illusion that private desire can remain separate from public life. Men like Julian always think they can wall off one room in the house and keep the smoke from reaching the rest." Rowan thought of the card in the safe, of Aspen, of her mother's handwriting. Not now. He's already suspicious. "How long did it go on after I was born?" Lenora's eyes flicked to the window, where the winter light had turned flatter later. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough that I changed hotel bookings under foundation travel. Long enough that I learned which messages should go to a private line and which could go through reception. Long enough that by the time anyone might have called it a scandal, it had calcified into routine. There were moments in life when truth arrived not as revelation, but as degradation. A lowering, a stripping away of any final dignified version of events you might have secretly been preserving for yourself. Rowan had not realized until now that she had been preserving one. Not a noble version, not even a forgiving one, just a smaller one. One mistake, one desperate season, one terrible secret born out of some single collapse in judgment. Not this. Not a system. "And he still kept me," Rowan said, hearing how wrong that sounded the instant it left her mouth. Lenora heard it too. "You were not a dog. Someone decided not to surrender," she said, not unkindly. "But yes, he kept the structure intact." "Because he's magnanimous?" For the first time, Lenora looked almost offended. "Your father was many things," she said. "Magnanimous was not one of the more reliable ones." "Then why?" Lenora's gaze rested on Rowan's face a beat too long, and Rowan understood before the answer came that she was about to hear something even worse than the last thing. "There was another private report," Lenora said. "Not one I filed, one I was instructed never to mention. I saw it only once because Gideon left it on his desk and assumed I would behave like furniture." Rowan's throat tightened. "It concerned fertility," Lenora said. "Not sterility, but impairment, low probability, poor numbers, the sort of medical information a man like Gideon Mercer would have regarded as an insult rather than a condition." The room went silent in a new direction. He had known, not just about Celeste, about himself. And Rowan's existence had solved more than one problem at once. Image, marriage, succession, masculinity. She felt suddenly sick, not physically, but conceptually, as if every family photograph on that staircase had been printed on paper too thin to bear the weight placed on it. "He knew I might not be his," she said slowly, "and he let the world assume I was because it protected him." "It protected the whole structure," Lenora corrected, "your mother included." Rowan looked up sharply. "You think I don't understand that?" "I think," Lenora said, "that understanding is not the same thing as deciding who disgusts you most." That shut the room down for a moment. Outside, a car passed somewhere beyond the trees. The kettle ticked as it cooled. Rowan pushed back from the table and stood, walking to the sink because movement felt preferable to breaking something. The window above it looked out onto a narrow yard, dormant hydrangeas, a bird feeder swaying slightly in the wind. Ordinary things, steady things, the sort of life built without a staff, a board, or a trust. Behind her, Lenora spoke more softly. "You were not the first child to be born into a bargain," she said. "But most people don't live long enough to know the exact terms." Rowan kept her back turned. Some part of her wanted to ask whether Celeste had loved Julian, whether Gideon had ever looked at her and seen a daughter rather than a shield, whether Lenora herself had hated all of them. But those questions belonged to a softer woman than the one standing at the sink. So she asked the practical one. "Who else knows?" Lenora answered without hesitation. "Fewer people than you fear. More than one would prefer." "Names?" "No." Rowan turned. "No, no," Lenora repeated. "I have given you the shape of the truth, not a witness list. If you want names, get them yourself. You're clever enough." "That's convenient. It's survival." Lenora rose as well, and though she was smaller than Rowan had remembered, she had not diminished. "Do not mistake my speaking at all for surrender, Ms. Mercer. I protected that family for 25 years because that was the work in front of me. I am no longer employed by them, but I am still not in the habit of detonating everything just because the children finally arrive at the center of the maze." "I'm 36. "Yes," Lenora said, "which in families like yours is still considered arriving late." The line would have been cruel from anyone else. From Lenora, it felt merely exact. Rowan picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. "Did he ever intend to tell me?" Lenora did not pretend to misunderstand who she meant. "No," she said. "Men like Gideon rarely tell the truth when it still has the power to cost them something." Rowan stood with her hand on the knob, the old woman's house warm behind her, and the winter day waiting outside like a clean blade. Then Lenora added, not quite loudly enough to soften the sentence, "But he did not treat you like a mistake." Rowan looked back. Lenora's expression had changed again, not into sympathy, into something harder to bear. Regret, perhaps, or recognition that one human life could be damaged by a transaction without being unwanted inside it. "That is not the same thing as innocence," Lenora said. "Don't confuse me." Rowan almost said she wouldn't. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The drive back to New York felt shorter than the one there, though she could not later have described the route. By the time the Mercer gates came into view again, the truth had settled into a form she could finally name. It was not that her mother had betrayed her father. Not only that, it was that for decades, several adults had stood around a living secret and each found a reason to keep it breathing. And Rowan had been the one asked to wear it. She parked by the side entrance and sat for a moment with the engine off, watching her own reflection ghost across the windshield. When she finally went inside, Mrs. Alvarez looked up from the hall table where she was sorting mail. "Will you be staying for dinner?" she asked. Rowan set her keys down carefully. "Yes," she said. Her voice sounded normal. That frightened her most of all. By the time Rowan came downstairs for dinner, the house had already rearranged itself around a new kind of tension, not visible chaos. The Mercers would not have known how to produce that, even if they wanted to. The table was set exactly as it had always been set in winter. Dark linen, low silver candlesticks, narrow water glasses, china with a platinum rim Celeste insisted was understated because the pattern had no flowers. Mrs. Alvarez moved through the room with her usual precision. The first course was served warm. The lights were low enough to flatter everyone and bright enough to discourage honesty. But the air had changed. It carried the thin electrical charge of a boardroom 5 minutes before numbers go public. Celeste sat at the far end of the table in a black silk blouse and ivory trousers, elegant in the way some women are elegant only after they stop trying to be young. Her face looked calm, but not rested. Elias had changed from his office suit into a charcoal sweater that somehow still suggested quarterly earnings. Naomi wore deep green and small gold hoops, understated by design, the way people dress when they want to be taken seriously without appearing as though they tried. No one asked Rowan where she had been. That told her more than any question would have. The first 10 minutes passed in the kind of conversation that rich families mistake for civility. Hospital updates. Which surgeon had called, which board members had sent flowers, whether Gideon's procedure would still begin on schedule Friday morning. Elias mentioned refinancing as if it were weather. Celeste said the foundation luncheon would have to be postponed. Naomi noted that several people had already reached out asking if the family planned to issue a statement. Rowan listened and ate very little. It was Naomi who moved first, not abruptly. Naomi never moved abruptly. She had too much respect for timing. Instead, she set down her fork, folded her napkin once, and said in a tone so neutral it might have been mistaken for practical concern, "Daniel called Elias this afternoon. There's a question about some older trust language that may need review before Friday." Celeste's eyes lifted. "This week?" "It's probably nothing," Elias said, which in his vocabulary meant it was already something expensive. Rowan looked at him. "What kind of question?" He hesitated just long enough to be caught. "A governance issue." Naomi took a sip of water. "More of a definitional issue, really." There were many things Rowan had learned in litigation, but one of the most valuable was this. Whenever someone used softer vocabulary around hard power, the subject mattered. "Define definitional," she said. Elias leaned back in his chair, one hand flat against the table. Naomi found a clause in one of the older Mercer legacy instruments tied to certain voting interests. It uses lineal descendant language. Keene thinks it's archaic and probably irrelevant unless challenged. Unless challenged. The phrase sat there between the plates like another guest. Celeste spoke first. "Why would anyone challenge it?" No one answered immediately. Naomi's expression didn't change, but Rowan felt the answer before she heard it. This was not about old drafting style. This was about vulnerability, leverage, contingency planning. "It matters," Naomi said at last, "because old language stops being decorative the moment a family becomes unstable." The line was smooth enough to pass at most tables. At this one, it was a blade with velvet on the handle. Elias shot her a quick look, not angry, more irritated that she had moved a step ahead of his preferred sequence. Rowan set down her fork. "And what exactly made the family unstable between breakfast and dinner?" Naomi met her gaze. "Nothing specific. I'm speaking generally." "No," Rowan said. "You never do." Celeste exhaled, small and sharp. "This is not the week for legal theater." That almost made Rowan smile. In her mother's world, legal theater meant any moment when contracts ceased to remain invisible. "It's not theater if the consequences are real," Rowan said. Elias rubbed a hand over his mouth. For a second, he looked older than his 41 years, not because of age exactly, but because some men only reveal the cost of being necessary when they are forced to manage several threats at once. "Fine," he said. "There's old trust language tied to voting rights in a set of family-holding entities. Keene flagged it because if governance were ever contested, certain interests might be limited to direct bloodline descendants." The wording was careful. Too careful. "Direct bloodline," Rowan repeated. "That's not exactly the phrase." "It's close enough." Naomi turned slightly toward Celeste, but the remark was for Rowan. Most old family structures have clauses like that. They're relics. They matter only if people insist on making them matter. There it was again, the performance of reasonableness that only appears once someone has already gamed out how to profit from a worst-case scenario. Rowan looked at her for a long time. Naomi did not look away. It hit Rowan then with unpleasant clarity, not the full extent of Naomi's knowledge, because she almost certainly did not have that, but the speed of her instinct. Naomi didn't need facts to feel the contour of risk. She had heard some shift in tone, seen some alteration in Rowan, watched Elias field one too many private calls from Daniel Keene and already begun building legal architecture around a possibility. It was almost admirable. Almost. Celeste's voice cut across the silence. I will not have this family picking apart bloodlines while your father is still alive. Something in Rowan hardened at that sentence. Not because Celeste was wrong in principle, but because she had chosen the word bloodlines with the unconscious confidence of someone who had lived too long inside a lie and started treating it as etiquette. No one has to pick anything apart, Rowan said quietly. If there's a clause, there's a clause. If it matters, it matters. And if it doesn't, Celeste replied, then perhaps we could let your father survive surgery before turning him into an estate problem. Elias pushed back his chair. Enough. He rose and crossed to the sideboard where the whiskey sat, though he didn't pour any. He only stood there with one hand braced against the wood, looking at the decanters as though one of them might contain a less exhausting family. Rowan watched him, remembering suddenly that as children he used to line up his toy soldiers by height before he did anything else with them. Even then he had liked order before action. What else did Keene say? She asked. He stayed where he was. He said there have been revisions in the last 8 months that complicate the older language. Now Rowan felt her full attention sharpen. Revisions to what? The trust structure, governance, certain control mechanisms. Naomi added too smoothly, Gideon's been making changes. Without discussion? Celeste asked. That question sounded real, more than real, offended. For the first time that evening, Rowan believed her mother had not known everything. Apparently, not all with discussion, Elias said. That was new too. Not just irritation now, something closer to injury. Rowan understood the board-level implication instantly. If Gideon had revised key trust or governance documents recently, and if Elias was only now learning the scope of those changes, then Mercer Holdings was not running on the stability he had been projecting. It was balancing on documents he hadn't fully seen, rights he hadn't locked down, and a father who may have chosen to die as strategically as he had lived. What kind of revisions? Rowan asked. Elias finally turned. Keene wouldn't discuss details by phone. Of course he wouldn't, Rowan said. Naomi rose then, not dramatically, just enough to shift the room. Let's stop pretending this is abstract. The family needs clarity. If the older language can be used to challenge control, then we should know by whom, under what circumstances, and with what exposure. That's not cruelty. That's risk management. No one missed the phrasing, not control. Challenge control. Not family, exposure. She wasn't speaking as a daughter-in-law now. She was speaking like someone who had spent 12 years learning which legal abstractions could destroy a life if left unaddressed. Rowan stood too. I assume when you say the family needs clarity, she said, you mean Elias. Naomi's face stayed composed. I mean everyone whose future depends on this structure holding. And whose future is that exactly? Mine, Naomi said, surprising them all with the honesty of it. My husband's, the board's, anyone tied to Mercer debt, anyone whose life gets rearranged if a trust fight freezes control. Elias closed his eyes for 1 second. There it is, Rowan thought. Not greed, then. Not only greed. Fear in better tailoring. Celeste sank back slightly in her chair. A trust fight, she said, almost to herself, as if saying it aloud made it vulgar. God! Rowan picked up her water glass and set it down again, untouched. Her mind was already moving faster than the conversation. If Naomi had found the lineal descendant clause, then the drafting must be accessible somewhere in the older Mercer legacy binders or in Daniel's summary notes. If Gideon had revised control mechanisms recently, those changes likely sat in a codicil, side letter, governance memorandum, or restatement. If Keene was refusing details by phone, then the revisions were material enough to change incentives. And if incentives were changing, then the family secret she had just uncovered was no longer only emotional. It had crossed fully into structure. She saw it all at once, Naomi weaponizing bloodline language, Elias needing uninterrupted voting control for his refinancing, Celeste panicking at the possibility of public fracture, Gideon still alive in a hospital room, having already laid some posthumous trap, none of them yet fully understood. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it clarified everything. This was no longer just a question of who her biological father was. It was a question of what that fact could do if set loose inside a family whose wealth had always depended on the pretense that lineage and control were the same thing. Naomi reached for her glass again. "I'm not suggesting anyone do anything indecent before Friday." "You're just making sure the battlefield is measured first," Rowan said. Naomi did not deny it. Elias turned from the sideboard at last. "Daniel is coming tomorrow morning. We'll discuss it then." "We?" Rowan asked. His jaw tightened. "The family." For a second, no one moved. Then Celeste stood, gathered her napkin, and said in a tired voice that carried more years than Rowan was used to hearing, "I am going upstairs before one of you mistakes strategy for loyalty again." She left the room without waiting for anyone to respond. Naomi watched her go, her expression unreadable. Elias poured the whiskey after all, but didn't drink it. Rowan looked from one to the other and understood that dinner was over in every way that mattered. When she stepped out into the hall a minute later, the house seemed larger than before, not because of its size, but because all at once she could feel how much of it rested on paper no one had yet laid on the table. A clause, a revision, a codicil, a bloodline, a vote. The war had not started loudly, it had started in language. And somewhere inside Daniel Keene's files, Gideon Mercer had left behind something that none of them were prepared to inherit cleanly. Celeste asked Rowan to meet her at the conservatory the next morning, not by text, not through Mrs. Alvarez. She appeared at Rowan's bedroom door just after 9, already dressed for a day she had no intention of spending in public. A dove-gray cashmere sweater, cream trousers, a thin gold watch, her face almost bare except for lipstick, and the kind of under-eye concealer women of her generation considered private, almost shameful if noticed. "Walk with me," she said. No preamble, no softening line, no mention of the dinner table, Naomi, Daniel Keene, or the word bloodline still hanging over the house like a smell no one could quite locate. Rowan followed her downstairs through the West Hall and out across the stone path toward the glass conservatory she had seen from her bedroom window the day she arrived. In summer it held orchids, citrus trees in terracotta pots, and Celeste's preferred version of usefulness, beauty that could be tended. In winter it was quieter. The heating system ran low and steady. The glass carried a pearled film of morning condensation. Outside, the lawns lay pale and rigid under the cold. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp soil, rosemary, and old sunlight caught in leaves. Celeste had always liked rooms that softened people without exposing them. She did not sit immediately. She moved between the planters with one hand lightly grazing the edge of a terracotta basin, as if she needed the contact more than the support. Only when she reached the far end of the conservatory, where a wrought iron table stood beneath the highest panes of glass, did she finally turn. There were mornings when Rowan could still see her mother as the most beautiful woman in any room. Not youthful, not girlish, nothing as simple as that. Celeste Mercer's beauty had always come from arrangement. Bones, posture, discretion, and the disciplined refusal to spill more emotion than the setting could survive. It was one of the things Rowan had inherited from her, though sharpened into a colder instrument. "I'm going to ask you something," Celeste said, "and I'd prefer an honest answer." "You may not like the novelty." Celeste ignored that. "How much do you know?" There it was. No denial, no confusion. No attempt to make Rowan say it first. The directness almost unnerved her more than a lie would have. "Enough," Rowan said. "Not everything." Celeste lowered her gaze for a fraction of a second. "Lenora." It wasn't a question. "Yes." A long silence followed, but it felt different from the silences between Rowan and Lenora. This one had history in it, not just withheld information, but layered injury, habits grown over decades, the strange fatigue that existed between mothers and daughters who had learned too early that love was often delivered through management rather than trust. Celeste sat first. Rowan remained standing another moment, then took the chair opposite her. Neither touched the tea tray already waiting on the table. "Then I won't insult you," Celeste said. "Julian Vale is your biological father." The sentence entered the room cleanly. No dramatic pause, no trembling confession. Just fact, placed between them like something too late to soften. For a moment, Rowan watched her mother's face instead of reacting. She had expected guilt, perhaps, or defensive elegance, some performance of pained necessity. What she saw instead was exhaustion, not theatrical exhaustion, not the fragile glamour of a woman collapsing under truth. This was older than that, the look of someone who had spent half a lifetime keeping too many internal drawers from sliding open at once. "How long," Rowan asked, "were you planning to let me stay ignorant?" Celeste's mouth moved, not quite into a smile. Planning suggests an orderly future. I wasn't planning. I was postponing. That's your distinction? It matters to me. Of course it does. Celeste looked out through the glass wall to the frozen line of hedges. It began before you, she said. That's probably the part you hate most, although there are other parts you haven't decided to hate yet. Don't narrate my reaction for me. I'm not. I'm trying to save time. That was so precisely Celeste that Rowan almost laughed. Even now, even here, efficiency before comfort. Your father and I were already breaking long before Julian mattered, Celeste continued. Not publicly, not in the way people recognize from movies or from their neighbors. We still hosted dinners. We still traveled. We still appeared where we were meant to appear. But privately, she paused. Privately, the marriage had become a ledger. The word landed harder than Rowan expected because it sounded true. Not romantic, not cruel in a cinematic way, just exact. What does that mean? She asked. It means that by then your father no longer spoke in feelings unless they could be attached to leverage. It means every serious conversation in the house ended with a reminder of who was carrying what risk, who was owed what loyalty, who had signed what, whose name was on which account. Celeste's voice remained even, but there was something under it now. Anger, old and compressed into a smaller shape by time. I had become useful in ways I did not fully understand until it was already difficult to disentangle myself. Rowan thought of Lenora's phrase, legally inconvenient. You found out about the finances, she said. Celeste's eyes flicked back to hers. A tiny movement. Confirmation. Yes. What exactly did he do? Not what you're hoping for, Celeste said. No one hid criminal embezzlement under my maiden name. Nothing so easy to summarize. But there were guarantees, exposure routes, private structures I was expected to sign without full context. The sort of things wives are told are routine until they stop being useful wives. You could have refused. Celeste met that without flinching. You say that like refusal exists in one moment and not as a chain of consequences. That angered Rowan more than she expected. Did it? She asked. Or did you just decide the consequences were unpleasant enough to call yourself trapped? Color touched Celeste's cheeks then, the first real sign that the conversation had reached skin rather than surface. I did decide things, she said. Don't flatter yourself into thinking I'm asking to be treated like a prisoner. I wasn't imprisoned. I was compromised. The word sat between them. Compromised. Not innocent, not powerless, not monstrous. The kind of word adults use when they want accuracy instead of absolution. And Julian? Rowan asked. Was that compromise too? Celeste looked away. This time the silence stretched longer. No, she said at last. That was selfish. The honesty of it hit harder than denial would have. He was kind to me at a time when kindness had become rare. He listened before he evaluated. He saw me as a person before he saw me as an extension of Mercer. She folded and unfolded one hand in her lap. I'm not dressing it up as love because that would insult everyone involved, including you, but it was not meaningless. Years, Rowan said. You let it go on for years. Yes. And when you got pregnant? Celeste closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. I knew it might be Julian's. Might be. Not a confession softened by ambiguity, just the ugly truth of uncertainty at the wrong time. And you said nothing. I said many things, Celeste replied, just not to you. Rowan leaned back in her chair. The conservatory felt too warm now, the air too still. When did you tell Gideon? I didn't. That startled her. He found out? He knew enough. Celeste's voice thinned on the edges. Men like Gideon never need a full confession if the shape of the threat is visible. He suspected before you were born. Then he had his own reasons for not asking the final question. Rowan heard the second layer inside that sentence immediately. The fertility report. Celeste's face changed, not with surprise that Rowan knew, but with the private shock of realizing how far the secret had already traveled outside her control. Lenora told you that too. She told me there was one. Celeste exhaled slowly. Yes, he had testing done, quietly. He never forgave the doctor for existing after that. For one brief, almost unbearable second, Rowan saw her father not as Gideon Mercer, the builder, the strategist, the man whose name sat on letterhead and projects and donor walls, but as a man confronted with a weakness he could neither buy nor command away. It did not soften him, but it made him legible in a way cruelty rarely allowed. So my birth solved several problems at once, Rowan said. Celeste did not dress it up. Yes, there was no point pretending otherwise now. It solved the marriage. It solved the optics. It solved succession. It solved the humiliation of a man who could build towers but not trust his own body. Rowan stared at the untouched teacups. Do you understand how disgusting that sounds? Yes. And you still expect me to believe this was about protecting me? Celeste's expression sharpened for the first time, not into coldness, but into something more dangerous. Conviction. I do not expect you to believe anything on faith, she said, but I know what the alternative would have been. Do you? Yes. The answer came so quickly, it nearly broke. I know exactly. Celeste stood as if sitting had become untenable and walked a few paces toward the glass. Her reflection appeared over the winter garden, thin and pale and impossibly composed from the back. You think if I had told the truth then, she said, you would have grown up freer? Maybe. Or maybe you would have grown up as the child at the center of a public fracture between a powerful husband, a compromised wife, and a man too cowardly to claim you. Maybe you would have been protected by no one. Maybe every room you entered would have contained the story before you did. She turned. I kept you as Rowan Mercer because that name opened doors no one else in that period of my life could have held open for you. Education, security, distance from scandal. Yes, it protected him too. Yes, it protected me. But do not talk to me as though I left you on a curb and came back later to call it sacrifice. The force of that rose through the room and then settled again almost immediately, as if even anger had been trained in her too long to fully show its face. Rowan stood too. I didn't need a perfect mother, she said. I needed a truthful one. Celeste absorbed that without defense. I know. No explanation. No but. Just those two words, stripped down to their simplest misery. Rowan looked at her then, really looked, at the careful mouth, the watch at her wrist, the tendons visible now at the base of her throat when she swallowed, all the signs of age and effort and discipline her mother had spent a lifetime containing under polish. She loved this woman. That was the problem. Not enough to excuse her, not little enough to dismiss her, just enough to make rage feel unfinished. "Why now?" Rowan asked. "Why ask me out here and say it this way?" Celeste glanced toward the house, visible through the bare branches beyond the conservatory glass. "Because last night at dinner, I realized something had changed in the room." "Naomi?" "Yes, Naomi smelled risk." A weary flicker crossed Celeste's face, and once people like Naomi smell structural risk, they stop being relatives and become future litigants. That sounded almost like admiration or warning. "So now you tell me because the lie has become inconvenient again." "No," Celeste said quietly. "I tell you now because for the first time, the lie is no longer mine to manage." The line stayed with Rowan, not because it redeemed anything, because it was probably true. After a long silence, Rowan asked the question she had not wanted to ask because it felt too young, too exposed, too close to the center. "Did you ever think about leaving? Truly leaving?" Celeste's answer came without hesitation. "Yes." "When?" "When you were an infant. Again when you were 7. Again after Elias left for college. Again the year Gideon had the first arrhythmia episode." A faint, humorless smile touched her mouth. "People imagine women like me stay because we cannot picture a different life. That isn't accurate. Often we can picture it too clearly. We simply fail to choose it." "Why?" Celeste looked at her as if the question were both cruel and deserved. "Because after enough years inside a beautiful cage," she said, "a woman starts calling the bars architecture." The sentence moved through Rowan with the force of something she would remember against her will. No apology could have reached her the same way. Celeste stepped back toward the table and finally lifted the teapot, though her hand was unsteady enough that she set it down again without pouring. "I am not asking you to forgive me," she said. "That would be vulgar at this stage." Rowan blinked once. "At this stage?" Celeste's mouth softened, not into warmth, but into the nearest thing she allowed herself. "You always were my daughter, whatever the biology says. That may not be enough for you anymore, but it is still true for me." There was no answer Rowan could give that wouldn't cheapen the moment by pretending resolution where none existed. So she said nothing. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the bare branches against the glass roof. Somewhere in the main house, faint through the conservatory walls, a phone began to ring. Celeste straightened instinctively at the sound, as though her body still answered the household before it answered herself. Rowan noticed, and something in her hurt in an entirely new way. Not pity, not forgiveness. Recognition of inheritance beyond blood. When Celeste finally turned toward the door, she paused only once. "There are things I told you today that I have never said aloud in full," she said. "That doesn't make them generous." "No." Celeste rested her fingers on the frame. "It doesn't." Then she left Rowan alone in the humid, herb-scented quiet of the conservatory with the untouched tea cooling on the table and the strange, unbearable fact that the truth had not made her mother simpler. It had only made her harder to hate cleanly. Rowan called Julian Vale's office at 10:12 and told the receptionist she would wait as long as necessary. The woman on the line had the polished calm of private medicine, too discreet to sound curious, too efficient to sound kind. Rowan gave only her name, nothing else. No explanation, no family connection, no mention of Celeste or Gideon or the word biology, which seemed too crude now for what the truth had become. There was a pause, soft keyboard sounds. Then the receptionist came back. "Dr. Vale has a narrow opening at 4:30. 40 minutes. "I'll take it." The office was on the Upper East Side in a building with an address expensive enough to eliminate the need for decoration. The lobby smelled faintly of stone dust and lilies. A concierge in a navy suit directed her upstairs without asking whom she was there to see. Wealth liked recognition better than verification. The waiting room outside Julian's private suite was not overly luxurious, which somehow made it more expensive. Cream walls, abstract canvases in muted blues and rusts, chairs upholstered in pale leather that no one with children or dogs would ever select on purpose. The magazines on the table were current, which meant someone cared about appearances even in the details no one was supposed to notice. A man in his 60s rose from one of the chairs when he saw her come in. He was tall, silver-haired, trim in the polished way of someone who spent real money avoiding softness. His coat was folded over one arm, scarf wound twice at the throat, watch discreet, but unmistakably costly. He looked briefly at Rowan, then away again, the practiced avoidance of a person who understood that privacy was part of the service being sold here. Medicine, Rowan thought, was not so different from law or wealth. Entire industries built around what people were willing to reveal only if the room looked safe enough. The receptionist stood as Rowan approached the desk. She was in her 30s, maybe, with dark hair pulled into a low twist and a face composed into professional neutrality. Her nameplate read, Mara. Ms. Mercer, she said quietly, as if Rowan's presence belonged to a category that required lowered volume. Dr. Vale is just finishing with a call. He'll see you shortly. That shortly stretched to 11 minutes. Rowan spent them staring at a framed black and white photograph of sailboats in heavy fog. It looked like art selected by committee, tasteful, distant, emotionally noncommittal, the perfect image for a man who had spent his life treating hearts without ever becoming legible himself. At 4:42, Mara stepped out from behind the desk and opened a side door. Dr. Vale will see you now. His office was larger than it needed to be and quieter than any room in which truth was likely to occur. 2 walls of books, 1 wall of windows looking over a pale winter city. A long cabinet with framed photographs turned just enough outward to suggest warmth without inviting inspection. On the desk sat a blotter, a brass lamp, and a stack of file jackets perfectly squared. Julian Vale was standing when she entered. He had been handsome once in the way old money magazines like to call distinguished before a man had earned the softer word. Age had narrowed him rather than thickened him. His hair was white at the temples and silver elsewhere, his face lined with the kind of fine fatigue that came from years of being looked at approvingly. He wore a dark suit without a tie, white shirt open at the throat, the look of a man performing informality at a high level. His eyes were Celeste's age, but not her kind of tired. Rowan, he said. He did not say Ms. Mercer. He did not say, please sit first. He said her name like he had rehearsed it in private and hated himself for needing to. She did not offer her hand. I didn't know whether you'd come, he said. That suggests you expected I might. Julian's mouth shifted almost into a smile, then thought better of it. I expected this day in the abstract. That's different from expecting it on a Tuesday. Rowan stayed standing. He noticed and gestured toward one of the chairs in front of the desk. Would you like to? No. A beat passed. He nodded once. All right. There were many openings she could have chosen. Why didn't you claim me? Why did you let this continue? Did you know for certain? Were you ever going to tell me? Any of them would have been earned. Instead, she asked the question a lawyer asked first. How long have you known? Julian looked at her for several seconds before answering, as if deciding whether honesty had any dignity left by this point. I never had proof, he said. Not at the beginning, only timing, probability, certain absences in the story I was being told. Don't romanticize ambiguity. How long? His gaze flicked briefly to the windows, then back. I suspected before you were born. There was something almost obscene about how unsurprised she felt. And after I was born, I knew it was possible enough to matter. Possible enough to matter, Rowan repeated. That's a very doctorly phrase. It's also a coward's phrase. That stopped her for a moment, not because it absolved him, because it didn't. It was the first thing anyone in this story had said about themselves without cushioning it. Julian moved around the desk, not closer, just enough to break the formality of the room. Up close, Rowan could see what the waiting room had blurred. The strain held at the corners of his eyes, the slight flattening around the mouth of a man who had learned too late that self-respect and reputation were not the same thing. I wanted certainty, he said. Then I wanted access. Then I wanted time. Those are the stages men like me move through when we are trying not to name what we are actually doing. And what were you actually doing? He did not answer immediately. Choosing the version of events that cost me the least, he said at last. There it was. No noble language, no tragic framing, just moral failure stated in a sentence too plain to hide in. Rowan crossed her arms. Did my mother ask you to stay away? Yes. And that was enough? No. Julian's expression tightened. Gideon made sure the answer became enough. How? That question seemed to age him in real time. He walked to the cabinet, touched the edge of a framed photo without looking at it, then turned back. You know what Mercer was 25, 30 years ago? Ambitious, leveraged, expanding. He gave a short, humorless exhale, and deeply networked. Foundations, boards, hospital giving, private donors, political introductions. Your father did not need to threaten me in a dramatic way. He only needed to explain, once, with sufficient clarity, how fragile a reputation could become if the wrong people began asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. And you believed him. I understood him. That was worse. Rowan felt heat move through her chest, not the wild kind, but the slow burn of contempt finding its oxygen. So you let him keep me. Julian winced almost invisibly. That is not language I can bear hearing from you, though I realize I've done nothing to deserve better. Try. He accepted that. I let the structure hold, he said. Your mother made her decision. Gideon made his. And I told myself I had no moral right to blow open your life without certainty that I could offer anything better than scandal. Could you? Probably not. The honesty of that room was beginning to feel more punishing than lies. Rowan moved to the window, needing distance, not from him exactly, but from the arrangement of the office, the careful masculinity of it, the muted confidence, the patient implication that the man who occupied it had been useful enough for long enough to excuse his silences. Below them, the city moved in narrow ribbons of traffic between dark rooftops and reflected light. Everyone down there carrying secrets too small to make national tax structures tremble. When did you stop telling yourself you were protecting me? She asked, and start understanding you were protecting yourself. Julian's answer came quickly this time, much later than I should have. She laughed once. It had no humor in it. You don't get credit for eventual self-awareness. I know. The repetition of that phrase, her mother's phrase yesterday, now his in another room, almost made her sick. Two people tied together by blood and history and weakness, both arriving at truth as if lateness itself were a virtue. Then why am I here? She asked. Why did you take this meeting? Julian looked at her with something that was not exactly hope and not exactly dread. Because there is one thing I kept, he said. Not because I'm proud of that, because I never entirely trusted Gideon to destroy what he no longer wanted seen. He crossed to the desk, opened the top drawer, and withdrew a flat cream folder. No monogram, no legal seal. Just old paper, carefully preserved. He set it on the blotter between them, but did not push it toward her yet. Daniel Keene knows about this, he said. Rowan's attention sharpened immediately. Knows about what? About the existence of a letter. Not the full contents, I think. Though with Daniel, one should never confuse lack of disclosure with lack of knowledge. That sounded right enough to be credible. Julian laid one hand flat on the folder. Gideon wrote it years ago, he said. Not recently. He never sent it. I came into possession of a copy through circumstances that would take longer to explain than you would have patience for, and I suspect the original may no longer exist. But Daniel knew it had existed. He knew because Gideon spoke of it once in one of those conversations men have when they want the satisfaction of confession without any real intention of consequences. Rowan stared at the folder. Something about paper remained uniquely capable of changing the temperature of a room. "What's in it?" she asked. Julian's face altered then, not toward softness, but toward something harder to witness in a man his age: shame. "Not redemption," he said. "Don't worry about that." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten letter on heavy cream stationery. Gideon's handwriting was exactly what Rowan would have predicted. Large, controlled, slanted slightly right, every line pressed down as though ink itself needed managing. She did not sit down to read it. She remained standing over the desk, one hand braced against the wood. The opening line was not sentimental. "If you are reading this, it means circumstances have forced my hand without the courtesy of my permission." "Of course." Rowan read in silence. The letter did not deny the biology. It did not apologize in any language anyone normal would recognize as apology. Gideon wrote of structure, family name, calculation, reputation, and the weakness of other people. He wrote of Elias with cold accuracy that bordered on contempt. He wrote of Celeste as if she were both accomplice and cost center. He wrote of Rowan in a way that made her stomach tighten. Not warmly, never that, but attentively. He said she was the only one of them who had learned not to confuse possession with identity. He said she had the least sentimental attachment to the Mercer mythology, which made her the only one fit to interfere with it. He said legacy, entrusted to those who need it for self-definition, inevitably rots. Her eyes moved faster. Then came the part that mattered most. He referred, not in full legal language, but clearly enough, to revisions he had made. Governance changes, control provisions, decision rights attached not to public prestige or simple inheritance, but to judgment, to who could prevent damage rather than who could most profit from the name. Not cash then, power, or something more dangerous than power: veto. Rowan looked up. Julian had not moved. He stood with both hands loosely clasped, like a man beside a hospital bed waiting to hear whether the patient blamed him for the diagnosis. "He wrote this and never sent it," she said. "Yes. Why keep a copy?" Julian's voice lowered. "Because at some point I understood that my silence had made me useless to you in every active sense. This was the only thing I had that might one day keep you from being blindsided by decisions made in your name, around your name, or against your name." "That's a beautiful justification." "It's a poor one." He didn't resist. "But it's the honest one." Rowan closed the folder. Daniel knew. Gideon wrote it. Revisions existed, and whatever had been changed in the last 8 months was not random housekeeping. It was intention. "You're still leaving something out," she said. Julian's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes." "What?" His answer came in pieces, as if even now he was choosing where to let the blade enter. "I am not giving you this because I want to be your father," he said. "That would be obscene this late. I am giving it to you because Gideon, for all his vanity, did see something correctly. You are the only one in that house who might know how to stop the others from turning this into pure appetite." Rowan stared at him. He held the gaze and added quieter, "That includes me." For the first time since arriving, she believed him fully about something, not because it made him better, because it made him smaller. Human-sized, failing-sized, not mythic enough to hate cleanly anymore, which was somehow worse. She picked up the folder. "I'm not thanking you. I wouldn't." At the door she stopped, not turning back immediately. "There's one thing I still don't understand," she said. "If you knew what Gideon was, why did you keep orbiting the family for all those years? Why stay close enough to be useful?" Julian's answer took longer than all the others, because at last he had reached the truth he could least admire in himself. "Because weakness does not always look like retreat," he said. "Sometimes it looks like proximity without courage." Rowan let that sit in the room. Then she opened the door and left him standing in his expensive office with the city at his back and nothing in front of him that resembled absolution. In the elevator down, she opened the folder once more and reread the line about interference, the only one fit to interfere with it. By the time she stepped out onto the street, the wind cutting sharp between buildings, she understood the real cruelty of the letter. Gideon had not given her love. He had given her responsibility. And somewhere inside Daniel Keene's files, the legal version of that responsibility was waiting for her to find it. Gideon died at 3:17 on a Friday afternoon. The call came while Rowan was still in Daniel Keene's office, seated across from a conference table so long it seemed designed to turn every conversation into a matter of governance. She had arrived that morning carrying Julian's folder, 3 pages of notes, and the private certainty that Gideon Mercer had been planning around all of them long before his body gave him permission to stop. Daniel Keene had not yet shown surprise once. That alone was unsettling. He sat at the head of the table in a dark suit that looked as though it had been tailored sometime during the first Bush administration and maintained by discipline rather than sentiment. Up close, he appeared even more austere than Rowan remembered, his lined face almost ecclesiastical in its severity, his silver hair cut close, his hands long and dry and perfectly still when other people were speaking. He had the air of a man who believed disorder was real, only if documented. The call came to his assistant first, a soft knock at the door, then a low exchange in the outer office, then Keene turned his head slightly toward the glass. "Take it," he said to Rowan, as if her phone already belonged to the room. It was Elias. "Dad's gone." No preface, no voice breaking. Just the sentence itself, stripped of ceremony and therefore more intimate than any performance of grief would have been. Rowan closed her eyes once. Only once. When? 17 minutes ago. She could hear machinery behind him, hospital sound, process sound, the faint hum of modern death trying to remain efficient. Then lower, "Mother is here. Naomi's on her way back. We're waiting on the physician and paperwork." Paperwork, of course. "I'll come," Rowan said. When she ended the call, Keene did not offer condolences. He offered time. "We can resume tomorrow," he said. But Rowan didn't stand. That surprised him, not visibly. Daniel Keene had built a life around not allowing surprise to touch his face in public. Still, something altered in the set of his mouth. "No," she said. "We resume now." For the first time that day, he looked directly at the folder in front of her instead of at her hands, her expression, or the legal posture of the moment. "You already know enough to make that sentence dangerous," he said. "I know enough to understand that if I leave this office and go to the hospital with nothing clarified, everyone else gets the first version of the future." Keene leaned back slightly. Outside his windows, the January sky had turned the flat color of old steel. His office on the 32nd floor of a discreet midtown building was a study in curated discretion. Law books no one touched for daily work, abstract art expensive enough to be mistaken for restraint, carpeting that muted footsteps into insignificance. The room smelled faintly of leather, paper, and radiator heat. It was, Rowan thought, the sort of place where dynasties came to be translated into clauses. "You're right," Keene said. "They will." That was all. No moral language, no reassurance, just agreement. "Then explain it," Rowan said. "All of it. Not the family mythology, the structure." Keene folded his hands on the table. "In broad terms," he began, "your father spent the last 8 months revising 3 connected areas. First, the governance protocol for certain Mercer family holding entities. Second, the status of the original family land parcel in Dutchess County. Third, the approval thresholds attached to voting share consolidation should a restructuring or sale be attempted. Not money, Rowan thought. Not directly. Control. "And where do I fit?" she asked. "Inconveniently," Keene said. That almost made her smile. He continued before she could speak again. "The older Mercer Legacy Trust language includes a lineal descendant provision attached to specific legacy voting interests. As I told Elias, it is archaic, but not meaningless. Under normal circumstances, it would have remained dormant. Under contested circumstances, it becomes litigable. Meaning Naomi was right. Naomi was perceptive. His tone suggested that perceptiveness in others was a habit he respected and regretted equally. And Gideon? He did not like leaving dormant weapons in other people's hands. There it was, the logic of the revisions. Not generosity, not fairness, preemption. So he changed the structure. Yes. How? Keene slid a document across the table, not the full instrument, just a summary memorandum with his firm's header and a level of compression that suggested he had written it for himself, not for family circulation. Rowan read quickly. Gideon had not erased the older language. He had built around it. A revised governance framework now required a higher threshold for control actions involving the legacy parcel and the associated holding vehicles. More importantly, he had created what was effectively a consent gate. Certain transactions could not move forward without approval from a designated family governance seat, tied not to numerical ownership alone, but to named authority. Rowan looked up. You? Keene did not nod. He didn't need to. He named me. He named a role, then he named you to occupy it. Why not Elias? A flicker crossed the lawyer's face. Not amusement, something drier. Because your father believed Elias mistakes acquisition for stewardship. That sounds like him. It is him, Rowan set the memorandum down. And the land. Keene reached for a second paper. The original parcel was never fully absorbed in the way public narrative suggested. It remained segregated through an older chain your father chose not to regularize. He intended to use it eventually. He also intended, in my view, to keep everyone around him slightly off balance about its exact status. In your view? In 26 years of representing him, Keene said, I have found that formal legal interpretation and personal habit are often adjacent. That, too, sounded exactly right. Rowan thought of Lenora, of Aspen, of Celeste in the conservatory, of Julian's letter copy in her bag, of Naomi at the dinner table smelling structural risk like smoke in another room. And if this becomes public? She asked. Keene's expression hardened by a degree. Public in what sense? The truth, the biology, the clause, the revisions, all of it. He considered the question carefully, which made Rowan trust the answer more. Then several things happen at once, he said. 1. Any proposed consolidation tied to Mercer legacy voting interests becomes vulnerable to immediate contest. 2. Lenders watching governance stability may reconsider assumptions, especially if Mr. Mercer's death produces credible internal dispute. 3. The family loses the benefit of ambiguity, which, while frustrating to live inside, is often an excellent short-term financial environment. She almost laughed at that. Almost. And 4? She asked. Keene looked at her over the rim of his glasses. 4, he said. Your brother's current strategy becomes materially harder to execute. There it was. Elias. Refinancing, control, timing. The pieces had all been circling separately. Now they locked. Rowan sat back. Her father had died less than half an hour ago. Somewhere downtown, Celeste was standing beside a body she had once called husband. Elias was probably already speaking to physicians, administrators, maybe even the first of the board. Naomi would be calculating the shape of the next 72 hours with frightening efficiency. And here she was, on the 32nd floor, being handed the legal map of the battlefield before the funeral flowers had even been ordered. It should have felt monstrous. Instead, it felt inevitable. What exactly did Gideon intend me to do with this? She asked. Keene's answer came without softness. He intended to ensure that if Mercer legacy ever had to be defended from family, it would not be defended by the family member most hungry for expansion. That's not an answer. No, Keene said. It's motive. Rowan stood and went to the window. Far below, taxis cut thin yellow lines through wet gray streets. The city remained indifferent, which was one of the only dignities it reliably offered. She thought of Gideon's letter. Not cash then, power, or worse, veto. You knew about the letter, she said without turning. I knew one existed. Did you know what it said? Not in full. A pause. Enough to understand that he was trying, in his own warped way, to prepare for a future in which the mythology of the Mercer family became less stable than the paperwork. That sounded like Gideon, too. Never trust people if documents can outlive them. When Rowan turned back, Keene was still seated exactly as before, except for one hand now resting on a sealed envelope at his right. I have something else, he said. He slid it toward her. No letterhead this time. Just her name in Gideon's handwriting. Not mailed, not formally stored, preserved. Rowan did not touch it immediately. What is it? A personal instruction your father left with me, Keene said, to be delivered only if two conditions were met. First, that he died before finalizing a broader family meeting on the revised structure. Second, that you sought clarification before any transfer or consolidation proceedings began. Very flattering. Your father was not a man who trafficked in flattery. No, Rowan said. He trafficked in leverage. Keene accepted that. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, not a full letter this time, a note. Brief, hard-edged, unmistakably Gideon. If Elias presses for speed, slow him. If Celeste asks for peace, distrust the timing. If Naomi speaks of stability, count the exits. Do not let them turn legacy into appetite. You will know the difference. Rowan read it twice, then a third time, not because the words were difficult, but because they were so brutally legible. He had known them all, known her too, or thought he had. And he had died trusting no one enough to make this simple. Keene watched her fold the note back into the envelope. What does he think I am? She asked quietly. The lawyer's voice changed then. Not warmer, exactly, but less purely professional than before. He thought you were the only one in reach of the family structure who did not need Mercer to explain yourself to yourself. The sentence landed with the force of something more dangerous than praise. Because it sounded like burden disguised as confidence. Because it sounded true. Rowan put the envelope into her bag. I'm not going to the press, she said. Keene inclined his head once. Wise. I'm also not surrendering the field. That, he said, is why he named you. Silence settled between them again, though not the old kind from earlier chapters, not stunned silence, not confessional silence, not maternal silence. This one was operational. The silence that comes after terms have been understood, but before anyone has chosen their method. Rowan moved toward the door. Her hand was already on the brass lever when she stopped and looked back. When the family asks what you told me, Keene's expression did not shift. I will say, he replied, that I explained your father's revisions in appropriate preliminary terms. And if Elias asks whether I have legal standing to interfere? This time, Keene allowed himself the smallest, driest pause. I will tell him, he said, that interference is such an inelegant word. That was almost enough to pass for humor in his world. Almost. Rowan left the office with the memorandum, the note, and the peculiar weight of being trusted by the dead, for reasons the living would soon resent. In the elevator down, she finally let herself feel the full shape of it. Not grief, exactly. Not yet. Something narrower and more dangerous. Resolve. By the time the doors opened into the lobby and she stepped out toward the waiting car, she understood the real terms of the inheritance in a way none of the others did. She did not need the Mercer fortune. That was why she was the most dangerous person in it. Sometimes the hardest truth is not who betrayed you, but how long you were expected to live inside the lie. This story is a reminder that family names, money, and appearances can shape a life, but they should never decide your worth. In real life, too, peace often begins the moment we stop protecting what is false and start being honest about what is broken. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe for more. Wishing you peace, clarity, and the courage to choose truth over silence.